let's start with the questions. The elections in Turkey. I know that you are following the agenda in Turkey. So AK Party is, as you know, has again a victory in elections in Turkey. So how do you first evaluate the elections in Turkey and AK Party's victory in general terms?
I think it's very good. I'm not surprised by the AKP winning. I think they've done a very good job with the economy in Turkey, and I think that explains a lot of their popularity. I think there are some challenges for them now because obviously they didn't get. They got over 50% of the vote, but they didn't get so many seats that they could just introduce a new constitution without a problem. They do have a number of challenges which I think are very important over the next few years. For instance, what kind of new constitution they should bring in, relationships with a number of surrounding countries, relationships with the EU, particularly in order to unblock some of the chapters that are blocked by the EU, relationships with the US. I could go on. I mean, they have internal issues in terms of the fact that a lot of those Kurdish MPs won seats. They weren't allowed to be part of a party, but they have obviously got a significant voice in Parliament now. How do they establish better relationships with them? But generally, I've admired the way that the AKP has run Turkey. But I think there are big tests coming down the track.
So, among those tests, you say that the Kurdish issue comes first because you stand there already.
I think they're all.
How AK Party will handle that issue? What's your recommendation today? How can that issue? Because that issue is really already there again.
It is.
They boycott already the Parliament. So how can that issue be handled?
Well, they've addressed the issue of relationships with Kurdish people outside Turkey extremely well. I mean, we know that there have been bilateral discussions between Masoud Barzani in Iraqi Kurdistan. Trade is flowing extremely well into Iraqi Kurdistan. There's a lot of Turkish investment into northern Iraq, and so that in a sense is great. What the Turkish government now needs to do is look at southern Turkey and their own population and say, how can we stimulate the economy in that part of Turkey where we have a big Kurdish population,
right.
Because we have some very powerful Turkish companies nowadays, big construction companies, very powerful telecoms, and so on and so forth, where I'm not sure that enough is being done in terms of investment in eastern and southern Turkey.
So you say economy is important in order to handle that issue?
I think it's absolutely vital. Otherwise, you just create unrest. But if people see that they're becoming more prosperous, then I think that's the key to the whole thing, really.
But Kurdish Party always urge AK Party to sit down and reconciliation with Öcalan, PKK. So always put that Öcalan on the desk. So AK Party should talk with Öcalan in order to reconciliation.
I'm not. I wouldn't have any comment particularly on that, but I can understand the reluctance of the government to want to do that. There's too much history, but at the end of the day, probably you have to do that. We did that as British when we dealt with people in Northern Ireland, for instance. And eventually there has to be some sort of reconciliation. But funny enough, I haven't got the impression that Öcalan is such a big figure. I think there are many other ordinary Kurdish people who would be quite happy to talk, and provided that there was investment taking place and the Kurdish language was very much allowed and so on. And a lot of progress has been made. I mean, in terms of language rights, I think there has been a lot of progress. What I would like to see the new constitution do, though, is devolve more power through the different regions to local people, rather than being all centrally controlled. And that might help too.
The Kurdish Party, again, of the negotiations, and they say that we don't want to involve in the parliament, and we will go on our works in Diyarbakir. So, how do you find the Kurdish party's behavior on that issue?
On the issue
On after that, they don't want to go to the parliament because of the Hatip Dicle issue. You are following the issue. Hatip Dicle is taking his chance to take the seat in the parliament. So, how Turkish party is making the correct action?
What, by not coming into the parliament?
Yeah.
Well, I hope they would. I mean, I didn't agree when and Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland didn't come into the parliament here. I think if there is a parliament and they've been elected to parliament, they should come into the parliament. The big issue, of course, is why is the threshold for being a legitimate party in Parliament so high? It's 10% at the moment. You have to get 10% of the votes in order to qualify to be a party in the Parliament. Now that sounds to me a very high hurdle, and I hope the new constitution changes that.
But you say that the Kurdish party should go to Parliament and...
Well, the individual MPs have been elected as individuals. I hope that they will take their seats. Absolutely, and how can you have a proper parliament unless you've got everybody represented there?
Yeah.
And I would have thought that's important, and I hope that talks take place. But it seems to me that that's the first thing you need to do: take your seat in Parliament and then debate matters in a proper fashion, rather than take up a position before you get there. Absolutely. I mean, many people were quite happy with the way that the elections turned out in Turkey, that it was a relatively balanced turnout. The CHP became stronger.
I want to ask that question as well. Apart from that question, CHP also boycotted the swearing ceremony in Parliamentary. So, is it right, according to you?
Well, I don't understand why. You'd have to explain to me why they boycotted the opening ceremony. To the outside observer, we're interested in making sure that Turkey is a really well-functioning democracy and continues to be a great NATO member. I'm very interested in Turkey becoming a member of the EU, and so on and so forth. So, any sort of internal issue like that is a matter for regret, as far as I'm concerned. But I wouldn't know why, whether Mr. Erdogan has said something that the others didn't like, or I just don't know.
You say that you get difficult to understand.
I find it difficult to understand. But then you don't, it's difficult for Turkish viewers and readers to always understand why we do things in the UK, Probably when they watch Question Time in our parliament here, they think this is madness, People shouting at each other,
Yeah, it's normally in parliament, but also, one last question about Kurdish issue, and after that, again, more two questions. Kurdish people also Kurdish party wants their sovereignty, their home rule, their self-government. So how do you find that their expectation on that?
Well, I certainly know that whenever that question is asked in Iraq of the Kurds, they say no. We basically want our people to be free and be prosperous, but they're not talking about sovereignty. And I would hope that that is not the case in Turkey. I don't know for certain.
Is there any need for you, according to you, for Kurdish people to...
as long as the conditions are right there for people to be free, to be economically prosperous, and so on, I don't, it's like, what is sovereignty? I mean, you look at the UK, we're part of the EU. People complain about a loss of sovereignty because we're part of the EU. Yeah. But that's irrelevant, really. The relevant thing is that we have our human rights, that we have a higher degree of prosperity because we're part of the EU and so on. But of course, there are links between Kurds in different countries in the Middle East, and that's very important, and with Turkey. Those family ties are important, but you don't have to have a separate country in order to express that, in my view. And I think that only creates anxiety and paranoia and the feeling amongst the Turkish government that there is a plot to try and break up the country, and I think that's very unhelpful.
Sure. I would like to ask another question. It is about AK. After election, AK party more empowered after elections.
Yes.
And what's the reflection of this
Well,
more empowered AK party to the Middle East, on the Middle East? Syria. And
yes. When you say empowered, well,
yeah, empowered. Not. Let's say, again victory. Again,
Yes.
they have a right to manage the country. They lead the country. So how can this third time victory of AK party can be reflected in the Middle East issues?
I think the AK...
and let's put it inside the role model of Turkey in the Middle East.
Yes, I absolutely understand that. Well, I mean, the one thing the AKP has done over the last 10 years is make Turkey the centre so much more than it used to be of kind of international and regional discussion. Basically they're right there at the centre. If you're talking about Central Asia or the Caucasus, Turkey is an important player. If you're talking about the EU, Turkey is an important potential player. If you're talking about the Middle East, in terms of the Middle East, whether it's relationships with the Gulf or Iraq or Iran, particularly Iran, Turkey's important. So I think it's re-establishing itself as a really important player in the world. I mean, it's a new reality for us, really. But of course, once you have that situation, you then have quite a number of responsibilities. I mean, just look at what happens when you have a situation like Syria, where you have people coming across the border into Turkey. Right. And, what does the Turkish government do about that? It's a really difficult situation.
Yeah. So that we can say that Turkey is becoming more important role player in that area and in the world as well. And
it does.
Getting more power.
It does. And, of course, that then carries quite a lot of issues relating to Israel as well. And the flotilla that we had before was obviously a really difficult situation. And I mean, how Turkey plays out for the future, whether there's a second flotilla or whatever it is, these things now are much more significant than they used to be, and therefore I think there's an added responsibility for Turkey. They are a world player now.
Yeah. It's reportedly America wants, also Israel wants Bashar Assad and his team want to stay there, but to change the regime, to make reform. So what did them peers? You want Bashar Assad stay there, but only to change the reform?
I don't think that we've ever said that, and I think it's wrong for people in the first instance to simply say we must have a regime change and so on and so forth. I think you have to let the people of a country decide. And at the moment, the signs are that there's quite a strong movement for reform in Syria, but it's not yet so strong because of, one might argue, the power of the security forces in Syria. It's not yet so strong that people are calling for, that the majority are calling for Assad to be deposed. I mean, I still hope that it can be solved by peaceful means, but at the moment, the security forces seem, and this, I'm sure this is the perspective from Turkey, but the security forces do seem to be behaving appallingly and killing people and so on. But there are stories the other way that security people are being murdered and so on.
Yeah.
And I don't know how your press in Turkey is reflecting that. But of course, it's very difficult making a judgment from the outside. But I'm in favour of making sure that the regimes in the Middle East are liberalised. Now, if they can't be liberalised, then, and because there are too many vested interests, that's the point where you need to say, well, I'm sorry, the only way is to change the regime. But I don't think that any of our government have yet said that.
Yeah.
And I'm a member of, the coalition here, and so I take my lead from what the coalition says.
All right, okay. No.
Whereas that's not true with Libya,
Yeah.
where we have said that we believe that, basically Gaddafi should go and it's near the end.
So Assad also should. So the Assad as well? Like
No, I don't think we're quite there yet. We may get there. We may get
but
there.
now, not today.
But but frankly,
Yeah.
the most provocative thing. I mean, I'm talking to a Turkish news agency here.
Mm-hmm.
The most provocative thing is for the West to try and do these things. Even Libya, where the human rights issues were very, very clear.
Mm-hmm.
Be far more powerful if Turkey, Iraq, the players in the region were all saying to Assad, "You can't keep doing this." I mean, he appears to still have some respect within the country, but his apparatus, the Ba'ath Party and the security forces don't. So, really, rather than US or UK or EU trying to say things to Syria, which, frankly, we're not part of the, if you like, the Muslim community, it would be far more powerful if people like Turkey and Iraq and Iran and so on were delivering those messages, which I don't know whether they are.
Right. Okay. Well, back to CHP issue. They showed candidate as Ergenekon detainees.
Sorry, say that again.
CHP showed candidate on the elections. Ergenekon detainees. Haberal, Balbay. They showed who is detainees from the Ergenekon case.
Right.
Yeah. CHP showed them as candidate in the elections.
Right.
You know that issue. So, what do you think about it?
Well, I mean, if they haven't been convicted, are they on trial?
Mm-hmm.
They're not convicted?
Not convicted, yeah, but the prosecution is going on,
Well,
they're under prosecution.
Then fine. If they haven't been convicted, then people are entitled to be candidates.
Mm-hmm.
It's their choice, isn't it? And I suppose they were making a political point that they think they're innocent,
mm-hmm.
and,
But it's not they're innocent or not, yeah, because they are blaming with very important issues like they're trying to make a coup d'etat or something that killed lots of people. So like they're blaming such kind of.
Well, yes, but there are many different views about the Ergenekon case, aren't there? And I wouldn't dream of entering into that. That seems to me to be a very internal issue for Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
The AKP thinks there was a conspiracy, mm-hmm. other people don't. And I'm sure that the CHP were making a political point. But it's it's perfectly proper for a political party to make that kind of point.
Yeah.
I mean, unless under Turkish law it's invalid to stand as a candidate when you are charged with an offence, then they were perfectly entitled to do that. Whether politically that's sensible for them to do it, I mean, if they won, then I suppose you could say that their strategy was successful in that sense, because they were highlighting something about mm-hmm. these two men, presumably, to say that they're really innocent mm-hmm. and they wanted public support, But I just don't think it's not for me from outside to say whether or not they did the right thing. Mm-hmm. I think it's, the sort of thing that political parties do. You wouldn't want to comment on whether Nick Clegg was right to join the coalition on behalf of the Liberal Democrats, back in our general election. No, you wouldn't get an international politician really to comment on that. You'd say, well, let's see what the impact is, what the outcome mm-hmm. of the coalition is.
Mm-hmm. My last question is about economy in Turkey and in terms of investment in Turkey. How do you see the investment? Is this the right place to invest in now?
You bet. I think...
we should wait. Some foreign investors should wait a bit more.
No, I don't see. I think Turkey's been a place to invest in for several years now, probably since 2005, maybe even 2004. Mm-hmm. I think anybody who's invested in Turkey since then has done well, and the growth rate has been very good. Istanbul is becoming a real regional financial centre. It may even become an international financial centre for all I know. But certainly, my firm, we opened an office in Istanbul mm-hmm. in conjunction with some very, very good Turkish lawyers mm-hmm. last year. We're really pleased with progress there. And, of course, there are a lot of growing large Turkish companies. So our interest is in, making sure that Turkey really fulfills its potential commercially, and you can only do that as long as you make sure there's great political stability. So, in a sense, using both sides of the things that I do, which is partly business in a law firm, partly being a politician, the economy and politics are absolutely linked together, in my view.
Very interrelated.
Absolutely.
What about last question? Turkey-England relations. How is it going?
Turkey-EU relations.
No, UK relations.
Oh well.
Let's relate that the EU.
Yeah, do relate that, because what really upsets and worries me is the Turkish-French relationship. I mean, historically, as you know, in the 19th century, France used to be the place where a lot of the pashas and the members of the Ottoman family and so on were educated. People spoke French. There are a lot of French words in Turkish still. And that relationship between France and Turkey, or I should say the Ottoman Empire, was extremely important. And people went to university, went to the Sorbonne, and so on. Now, that's what baffles me, is that this is not still very powerful, and that France does not want Turkey to join the EU, whereas Britain, and we were, never as close as France to Turkey, we're now, I think, the closest European country in many ways to Turkey. We understand, entirely why it's important for Turkey to join, why with your young population you could really add to the power, if you like, the economic power of the EU. And again, many of us believe that the fact that Cyprus, for instance, was allowed to join the EU with only one half of it belonging was, especially since the Turkish Cypriots were in favour of unification under the referendum, we feel that was unfair. And basically, many of us feel that we've got to resolve that issue and unblock the chapters, unblock the ports, and that's a high priority for us in many ways. Now, I can't tell you how you go about that, but I think we have to have some statesmanship on all sides in order to solve that, because it is untenable to have 8 chapters or whatever it is blocked directly as a result of the Cyprus issue. But, Turkey has done many reforms since it applied to the EU. It's got to do more. But that, to me, the Cyprus issue seems to me to be one that definitely we need to make much bigger effort to resolve.
Foreign Secretary William Hague appreciates and applauds Mr. Davutoğlu very frequently, very too much.
Yes, basically you can see Cameron and Hague, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, both great fans of Turkey, great fans of wanting Turkey to come into the EU, and between them they've made quite a number of visits, and I think that's very important. I think Turkey needs to know that it has a very big friend and ally in the EU who wants it to join.